I think we're getting into the heavier release season because I got Flock out yesterday. No less than 3 games I'm interested in by the time this goes live, those being Flintlock Siege of Dawn, Dungeons of Hinterberg, and Kinitsugami Path to Goddess. And I got jump scared by this one. And that's not even taking these standard AAA releases into account. But this week, we're going into the indie Metroidvania, Gestalt Steam and CInder. If the music you're hearing in the background and the fact that I did a whole ass video on Bloodstained Ritual of the Night was anything to go by, I love Metroidvanias. That combination of platforming and exploration and using the tools you get from them to open up new paths into an extent of combat is something I live for. But with the exceptions of the genre's namesakes, the only ones I can claim to outright love are Batman Arkham Asylum and the Star Wars Jedi games by Respawn. Because most of the indie fare in the genre focuses too much on making a compelling gameplay experience, but they forget about the vibe, if that makes any sense. Let me explain. When a great game in this genre lets you feel like you're in a place, an actual place, that's when it solidifies the vibe. What I mean is that there's a certain feeling that comes from playing these games. From the cold isolation of the various alien-infested caverns and space stations in Metroid, the uncanny bordering on eldritch familiarity of Dracula's castle, the repurposed and differing sections of Arkham Island and Arkham Asylum, and the uncharted frontiers of the planet Kobo and Jedi Survivor. Through the use of environmental designs and gameplay challenges, they all manage to feel like actual living, breathing places. And even going so far as to become characters in their own right, by virtue of just spending so much time there. Gestalt, in the few hours I've played since release, passes this vibe check. It sets up this sweeping narrative of humanity on the brink of annihilation at the hands of demons, fighting back with the use of dangerous technologies, and eventually succumbing to said tech and warring amongst itself. It has cutscenes featuring characters talking about the politics of the world and talking a good 2 or 3 layers deep within the setting's context, or as I like to call it, the Pillars of Eternity method. And there's a lot of talking. Like, a lot of talking. Especially in the early hours, but it's all in service to setting up this narrative going forward, and it works well for the most part, even if it can be a bit in your face at times. And in between all of that, you play as a mercenary named Alethea, who gets caught up in all of this, and it's a wild ride. And you're probably wondering, how the heck does this make the world feel lived in? And the answer to that is because the world and the events moving in the background aren't beholden to the player character. You're just a small piece in the overall puzzle, and that's where the world becomes more of a character in and of itself. It's way more in-depth than how all these stories go with their world building, but it's a novel approach. And while it's only a few hours in, I'm genuinely intrigued with how the story is going to pan out. But that's enough about the story, world building, and vibes. Let's get to that sweet, sweet gameplay. Gestalt Steam and CInder follows the standard Metroidvania model of explore, fight, get new power or ability, go back to a previously inaccessible area with your new toys, get lost, repeat. I add that last part because I, as anyone following my work or knows me as a person remembers, have a goddamn terrible sense of direction. I'm always getting turned around, and I always have to check my map every 5 seconds to make sure I'm not getting lost like I'm Zoro in One Piece. This brings up the first thing about this game that caught my eye, which is the map. Its various areas and the main hub city are displayed as these huge chunks that show you the general area as opposed to the block-by-block map construction that Metroid and Castlevania use. It's fine for what it does, but I prefer to get a bit granular with my map construction. But I also weirdly don't find myself checking the map all that much because I can at least get around without getting too lost, which is a sign of a great map and great level design. I'm also surprised by the amount of verticality in Gestalt. The amount of ascending and descending that you do when traversing the world is awesome because it shows that there's an actual sense of literal depth to the world. Kind of like how Lordran in Dark Souls sort of vertically layers itself. However, if I do have to get more granular and specific, I would more readily say that the way the maps in Gestalt are structured is more akin to Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. You have the main city as a sort of hub, and the various sub-districts set up as regular self-contained stages almost. This makes a lot of them feel much more unique than they otherwise would, but while the previous statement of literal depth and Lordran-style layering is still applicable, it makes it so that these areas are also consequentially much smaller than you would expect. It's a price to pay for good interconnectedness, I suppose. Gestalt's combat is Castlevania style in the standard action platformer combat of jumping, shooting, and slashing. Alethea's saber and pistol do the majority of the heavy lifting, and while it is some basic stuff, it works out fantastically. The act of just slashing enemies feels good, much in the same way that jumping and general movement feel good. But back to the main combat, you have a standard 3/ combo that can be upgraded later in the tech tree for more moves to be added to chain. And you have a pistol that can be upgraded to hold upwards of 4 shots. There's also a forward and backwards dodge roll with a short internal cooldown to keep you from rolling around at the speed of sound. Remember that tech tree I mentioned a minute ago? Let's talk about it. The tech tree in Gestalt can be filled in with ability points that themselves are acquired in linear ways. These include leveling up, finding and destroying pylons out in the world, and even discovering way gates that act as save points. Those last two are an incredibly powerful way to incentivize exploration, and I love it so much. It can lead to you getting so much more powerful so much quicker. And you can see that from the major powers in the tech tree that you can eventually get an air dash, double jump, charge attacks, and more to make yourself more of a combat devil on top of these standard percentage passive increases. And you will need those because the enemies in Gestalt are no joke. You run into a bunch of rogue robots, various crime syndicates, and eventually mutant monsters that will test your limits. This is best seen in Gestalt's boss fights, and while I've only fought 2 of them so far, these were some of the hardest fights in the time I've spent with the game. Gestalt's combat difficulty is a breath of fresh air because a lot of Metroidvanias don't really allow for difficulty increases like that as time goes on. The most recent examples I can think of are Hollow Knight and Metroid Dread. But in the early hours, I was getting whooped. I welcomed it. Some areas took me a few tries to get through, but if it keeps up at this pace, then I'm looking forward to the pain. Gestalt Steam and CInder leaves a good first impression. It does an expert job of setting up its world and story and laying down the foundations for what is shaping up to be a hard-as-nails Metroidvania. While those smaller maps can be a bit disappointing, the way it all locks together and makes it for an incredibly cohesive map is something that I cannot stress enough. I've seen some Metroidvanias get crushed by this aspect, and Metamorphosis games nailing it in the early hours is a good sign. I'm sticking with Gestalt to the end, it's shaping up to be something special. And that will be it for this week's video. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like it if you did, and share it around as well. It helps the channel out a lot. Thank you, and have a wonderful weekend.